Good evening, friends. Tonight, you are invited on a slow journey to the mythical shores of ancient Greece, where tired and lost heroes wash up on the beach, wooden horses stand silently under the moonlight, and patient wives wait by the window for 20 years. Gently dim your lights, curl up under your blanket, and allow the day's noise to settle into stillness. If this calm and peaceful journey offers you even a little comfort, please consider liking and subscribing if you feel so inclined. These are the stories the Mediterranean waves have carried for 3,000 years, smoothed by time like sea glass until they reach the shores. Tonight, you will walk barefoot on those ancient sands, feeling the warm grit between your toes, and listen to the whispers of old sailors. Before we begin, I would love to know where you are listening from. Don't forget to write your city and time in the comments. It always excites me to see who is joining this journey from all around the world. Someone beginning their day with the sunrise in Tokyo, another passing midnight in London, or someone winding down after work in New York. Everyone meets in this story. Now, dim your lights. Perhaps turn on a fan for a soft ambient hum. Relax your shoulders, take a deep breath, and travel in your mind to a dawn-lit beach. Imagine that white strip of sand stretching between two rocky headlands like a graceful smile, completely free of crowds. The gentle, repeating sound of the waves accompanies you with serenity. This is Phaeacia Island, a place so peaceful that even the seabirds seem to whisper rather than cry out. Wandering this shore in the early morning, you notice something strange among the seaweed and driftwood. At first glance, you might think it's just ordinary wreckage or a broken mast. But when you look closer, you see a man, his beard darkened with salt, the desperate rise and fall of his breathing, and powerful shoulders that bear the marks of the terror he has endured. This is how Odysseus arrived at Phaeacia, though he didn't know the island's name then. In fact, he knew almost nothing. The last thing he clearly remembered was the raft he had built with his own hands on Calypso's island, being smashed by the relentless waves of Poseidon. He clung to a piece of wood for 2 days and 2 nights. His fingers were cramped, and his throat burned, raw from the salt water. When he finally reached the shore, his exhausted body could only drag him a few steps further onto the sand before he collapsed weakly among the dry leaves. The body that had carried him through 10 years of wars and the 10 subsequent years of exile had finally given up. He fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. There was nothing left for him to give. But wait, there is an important detail you must know about this beach. A small but magical detail that steers this entire story. The island's young women come to this shore every few days to wash laundry, and not just because they have to. The princess could easily have a maid handle her chores, but for Norris, leaving the palace to spend time with her friends and enjoy the pleasure of a simple task was an opportunity. She had woken that morning from an unusual dream, and it was still fresh in her mind. In the dream, Athena, the goddess of wisdom, had appeared at the foot of her bed. telling her that the day was right to wash the fine linens stored in the palace. Athena reminded her that wedding season was approaching and that clean garments were important. Nausicaa requested a mule cart from her father, King Alcinous. Instead of mentioning wedding preparations, she simply said the family's laundry needed cleaning. Her father understood everything and ordered the cart to be loaded with supplies. On the bumpy but cheerful road to the beach, Nausicaa chatted with the young maidservants in the back of the cart. Topics included the harvest festival and buying new fabrics. When they arrived at the beach, the work began, but when done with friends, it turned into an enjoyable game. They lit a fire and heated water in bronze cauldrons, sorted the clothes, and took turns washing them. The rhythmic sound of the water eased the labor. Dip, scrub, rinse. As the warm sun heated their shoulders, they spread the clean laundry over the stones. The landscape came alive with white, blue, and golden fabrics. When the work was done, there was time for a picnic and games. They tossed a leather ball in a circle, trying to keep it in the air. But on that day, someone threw the ball a little too far. For years after, they would debate who was to blame. The ball, sailing wide of the circle, crashes quickly into the thicket of wild olive trees where Odysseus sleeps beneath the leaf pile. The snapping of the branches is loud enough to awaken the sleeper. This sound is immediately followed by the girl's laughter, apologies, and arguments over who was at fault, creating complete chaos.
In these moments approaching morning, Odysseus suddenly jolts awake. His warrior instincts immediately put him on high alert against danger. In momentary confusion, as he tries to remember where he is, young feminine voices drift to his ears. The conversations are in a familiar dialect, but with a strange accent. Gently pushing the leaves aside, he cautiously peers through the olive branches. The sight instantly stops him. Sitting in a circle on the beach is a group of young women with graceful clothing and delicate hands. One of them, whom the others constantly look to for direction, must be the leader of the group. This person is slowly making her way toward his hiding place. Odysseus does not yet know she is Princess Norse. There is a quiet authority and a deep resolve in the young woman's posture. Though not the most beautiful woman he has ever encountered, there is a strange expression on Norse's face, something that moves him in the most human way, and suddenly makes him think of the daughter he would have raised in his imagination had she reached this age. This is where the story takes a truly unusual turn. Odysseus slowly grasps the utter desperation of his situation. Naked, filthy, far from his ship, his crew, and his home, he finds himself on an unknown shore. These young women represent his only chance of survival, people who can provide him with food, clothing, and aid for a safe journey. But how does one approach a sheltered princess and her group looking like a savage man hurled from the sea? The answer is clear: with caution and in the gentlest way.
First, he tears a leafy branch from a nearby olive tree. This is not just a symbol of modesty, but also a sign of respect for Athena, the goddess of wisdom and craft. Thus, those who see him carrying a branch will understand him not as a threat, but as someone seeking protection. Then he steps out from the thicket slowly but deliberately. His appearance is not charming, but it is striking. With skin darkened by sun and salt, hair matted with sea moss, and muscles hardened by years of war, He looks like someone intensely experienced and marked by the world. When the maidservants first see him, they scatter like birds, running halfway down the beach in sudden panic, then staring at him from a distance. But Nausicaa maintains her composure. Later, she would say this bravery was not heroic, but entirely practical resolve. She believes someone needs to intervene. Fleeing will not solve the problem. Odysseus keeps his distance and begins to speak to her. His voice sounds like an old mechanism unused for years and corroded by salt water, but his words are carefully chosen. He is unsure if she is a goddess or a mortal woman. His experiences demand caution in such matters. Therefore, he covers all possibilities. He praises her grace and beauty, even questioning whether she might be Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. Yet he then adopts a more realistic approach and tells his own story, that he was shipwrecked and that after 20 days on the wine-dark sea, he reached the shore thanks to the gods. He does not reveal his name or where he came from. He knows such information is dangerous to share with strangers. Instead, he requests simple human help. An old piece of cloth to cover himself, directions to the nearest city, and a blessing from the gods for her future marriage. What truly moves Nausicaa is not all the praise of her beauty and grace, but specifically the request for a marriage blessing. This is perceived as a sign of respect for her age and position. Though she has heard such compliments from many mouths before, the marriage prayer makes her feel something different. It suggests he understands her life situation and expectations. Thus, he shows her respect fitting a princess, not just an ordinary peasant. The events that follow are a small but moving example of human kindness.
Nausicaa calls her frightened servants back and organizes a relief effort. They bring him food, wine, olive oil for cleansing, and a fine tunic and cloak selected from the laundry. She then directs him to a secluded, tree-lined area where no one will disturb him, suggesting he wash and dress there. They will wait for him to return when his preparations are complete. The washing scene is not just a moment of physical cleaning, but also reflects the Greek view of hospitality and human dignity. Odysseus does not merely rest by the river or perform a basic cleaning. He undergoes a full ritual purification. He cleanses himself of salt and dirt, patiently washing his hair and rubbing his skin with olive oil until it glows. Finally, when he steps out of the water, his true self is revealed. In this state, he no longer looks like a wreck or a beggar dragged from the sea. Anyone who looked at him in that moment could see him as a powerful king with divine qualities. Nausicaa notices the change immediately. When she sent him to bathe, she was facing a desperate castaway. Upon his return, she finds a man standing before her like a hero stepped out of the epics. Tall and broad-shouldered, Odysseus moves with confident steps, displaying an innate and graceful leadership. Nausicaa finds herself lost in thought, wondering about his true identity, where he came from, and even if he might be the one the gods intended for her. However, her practical nature tells her that taking such a stranger directly to the palace would cause gossip, so she advises him on the path to the city. Follow the road, and the city will welcome you. Find the grove of Athena just outside the walls. Wait there until I go home and speak with my family. Then, come to the palace and ask for King Alcinous. Tell him you found me on the shore and that I offered hospitality. He will understand.
As she returns to the city, Norse reflects on the stranger she helped. She has performed a kindness, obeying the command of the gods. Yet this act could be a spark that changes her life, because there is something different about this foreigner. His speech, demeanor, and intelligence suggest he is no ordinary man. Upon arriving at the palace, Norse tells her father, King Alcinous, about the stranger. Alcinous, A ruler who values actions over appearances, asks the right questions. Is he armed? No. Is he dangerous? No. Was he respectful? Yes. When Odysseus arrives at the palace, he is led directly to the king's presence. The king observes him. Though tidy, he bears the traces of hardship. He does not ask where he came from. Instead, he invites him to the royal table, ordering food and drink to be brought. This is more than hospitality at the time. It is a sacred duty. It honors solidarity under the belief that every stranger might be a god in disguise. Odysseus silently enjoys his meal. He has not been nourished like this in a long time. As the wine mixed with water soothes him, the activity in the palace continues. The servants are busy with their tasks, but the curiosity in the room is palpable. Who is this stranger? Where does he come from? And where is he going? His demeanor, his scars, and his eyes, attentive to details, whisper a story worth hearing. Evening falls, and as torches burn in the bronze sconces, King Alcinous breaks the silence and asks, "My friend, you have eaten my food, drunk my wine, and been received with honor. But we wish to know, who are you? What distant land brought you here? What gods and men tore you from your home?" Odysseus places his cup on the table and looks at those in the room.
He hesitates for a moment. He knows the power and risks of his name. But these people have greeted him and fed him, asking nothing in return. He takes a deep breath, turns to King Alcinous, and speaks the words that signal the beginning of a historical tale. "I am Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca. If you have time, I will tell you the 20 years of my journey home. But that story is for another time. For now, we have something simpler, more beautiful. The kindness of a gentle princess, a helping hand that saves a desperate man, and a king who understands the value of humanity. Perhaps civilization is measured not by palaces or armies, but by how it treats its strangers. What stories do you think will wash up on our shores tomorrow? They say some tales begin with "once upon a time." This one begins with the sound of hammers, the smell of fresh wood, and the silent plans of men determined to make history. We still think of Odysseus, the man who washed up on Princess Norse's shore. To understand how he got to that point, we must go back in time. The answer lies in a war that lasted 10 years, hidden in an endless siege and a wooden horse that stood silently beneath the stars. Imagine standing on a hill overlooking Troy. Below you rise walls 12 meters high, 3 meters thick, complete with towers, structures built to keep the enemy out, proven functional. For 10 years, they faithfully performed their duty. Outside the walls, a temporary city stretches along the shore. Hundreds of ships are pulled onto the sand, the camp filled with thousands of tents and smoking fires, transformed into a battlefield where the young arrivals grew old and were consumed. The interesting thing about this war was that it was based more on routines than on constant conflict and bloodshed. The Greeks couldn't assault the walls, and the Trojans couldn't drive away the massive army. Thus, the sides settled into more of a hostile camp life. During the day, the Greeks inspected their ships, repaired weapons, gathered supplies, held ceremonies for the dead, and told stories around the fires in the evenings. The Trojans, safe behind their walls, focused on their daily lives.
Occasionally, there would be days when the two armies met. Heroes fought one-on-one, men died, but the war reached no conclusion. As the years passed and the 10th year arrived, everyone was weary. The Greeks were sick of longing for home. The Trojans were tired of the uncertainty. Even the gods seemed weary of the situation. It was at this moment that Odysseus developed his famous plan by thinking. The idea of the wooden horse did not emerge suddenly. It took shape after long discussions while searching for a solution to the endless war. Odysseus's revolutionary idea was to get the Trojans to invite them in, rather than trying to enter Troy directly. He found the way to achieve this by making the Greeks appear to have given up. They packed up their camps, loaded their ships, and seemingly abandoned the war, leaving behind a great wooden horse. This horse would appear to be a prayer for a safe return dedicated to the gods, and in their euphoria of victory, the Trojans would bring it inside as the greatest symbol of their triumph. Of course, the horse would not be empty. Hidden inside would be 30 of Greece's best warriors, including Odysseus. Once the horse was inside Troy and the city fell into a deep sleep, these men would climb out, open the gates, and usher in the main Greek army waiting under the cover of darkness. The construction of the horse took weeks. This was no crude wooden toy made by amateur hands. It was a masterpiece of carpentry, the work of Epius, the most skilled craftsman in the Greek camp. The horse was 9 meters tall and had been carved and painted to resemble a real living creature. Its eyes had a gleam polished with shining bronze that suggested intelligence. Its mane was intricately detailed, reflecting light in waves. Its legs were made of massive oak pillars, strong enough to bear not only its own weight, but also the burden of the warriors hidden inside. The entire operation was conducted in secrecy. The worksite was enclosed by canvas screens and guarded by trusted sentries to protect it from prying eyes.
As the project progressed, a noticeable shift in the camp's atmosphere was felt. The Greeks, who had expected nothing but the continuation of the same monotonous siege for years, now had a future filled with hope for the first time. They began to imagine truly returning home, seeing their families again, resting in the comfort of their own beds instead of sleeping rough in a foreign land. When the horse was finished, the Greek army staged one of the greatest deceptions in military history. They burned their camps, but did not completely destroy them. They arranged them to look abandoned. The care they took in loading their ships ensured that the Trojan observers on the walls could clearly see the scene. They also neatly packed up their siege equipment and placed it on the ships. And then, in the early morning, when everyone assumed it was just another day of siege, the Greek fleet silently sailed away. Imagine the magnitude of the silence that followed. For 10 years, the city of Troy had grown accustomed to waking up each morning to the sight of black ships on the beach and the smoke of cooking fires. Now, only empty sands, scattered debris, and the faint sound of waves hitting the shore remained. The first Trojan scouting party sent outside the walls couldn't believe their eyes at the sight they encountered. The Greek camp was genuinely abandoned. Some details suggested they had left in a hurry. They found broken pottery, scraps of fabric, and the cold ashes of extinguished fires. But there were no soldiers, no weapons, and no threat. And in the center of the camp, standing alone on the sands, was the massive horse, like a gift from the gods. Even the seasoned Trojan warriors who had survived 10 years of war were stunned by the sight. The horse was captivatingly beautiful. It was clearly not just a religious offering, but also a dazzling work of art. As the morning sun gleamed on its painted surface, the sea breeze kicked up dust around it, giving the impression that the horse was coming to life and preparing to run. When news of the discovery quickly reached the city of Troy, the people of Troy were filled with euphoria.
People poured out of the gates that had been sealed for years. and dared not be opened in daylight. Children who had grown up behind the walls saw the peaceful face of the sea for the first time, while women left flowers on the shore that bore the sad marks of war. The elders were overwhelmed with tears at witnessing the end of the wars. This moment had seemed impossible for them to even imagine. But what about the horse? The question arose here and divided the Trojans. Priest Kohan and his supporters argued that it was clearly a trick. "I fear the Greeks," Kohan said, "even when they bring gifts." But King Priam and others in his camp believed that the horse was a sincere offering to the gods by their enemies, a sign that they accepted Troy's victory. In the midst of this debate was Cassandra, cursed by Apollo to utter true prophecies but never to be believed. Cassandra looked at the horse, heard the whisper of disaster, and shouted a warning. The horse was full of armed men. It would bring death to Troy. It had to be burned immediately, or better yet, thrown into the sea before it could cause harm. But Cassandra's warning, like Apollo's curse, found no listening ears. There was a tragic truth here. Warnings made in desperation, no matter how true and urgent, are often ignored. Furthermore, the Trojans had been trapped behind their walls for nearly a decade. They needed to celebrate. They desperately wanted to believe that the long struggle was finally over. Convinced that the horse would be a symbol of their victory in this difficult war, the people decided to bring it into the city. They wanted to display this sculptural gift to future generations and prove the glory of Troy. However, the horse proved much heavier than expected, and hundreds of men along with oxen were used to move it. Furthermore, since it couldn't fit through the gates, they had to tear down a section of the city walls. Perhaps even this should have been a warning. But now the celebratory mood had prevailed. All practical concerns gave way to a communal joy. When the horse was successfully placed in the city's main square, the festivities reached their peak. Wine flowed like a river. Musicians played on every corner, and people celebrated their victory with songs and dances. Children climbed onto the massive horse's legs, trying to peer into the cracks in its wooden body.
The adults debated and wagered on the horse's meaning. Some said it was a sign to Poseidon for a safe voyage. Others believed it was an offering to Athena for wisdom. And some thought it was left as praise to Zeus for the victory achieved. Yet under the shadow of all this excitement, 30 Greek warriors waited silently inside the horse's belly. Since they were placed inside, they hadn't moved, hidden in the cramped space, using tiny air holes to breathe. Trapped but patiently waiting, these men listened to the sounds of celebration outside. The children's laughter echoing in the streets, the women's songs, and the clinking of men's cups raised to each other. Think of the Trojan victory and the Greek defeat. Professional soldiers who had fought for 10 years and lost friends and brothers. Now, in the darkness, surrounded by their enemies, they watched the night in a long vigil. As the sun slowly set, the celebrations continued around them. The sounds could be heard through the wood of the horse. A child struck the horse's leg with a stick, creating echoes. One of the hidden Greeks nearly cried out, but restrained himself. As evening approached, the celebration ended. Tired Trojans returned to their homes. The city guards took their posts, relaxed by the ceremony of their duty. When midnight arrived, the city was in a deep sleep.
This was the moment they had been waiting for. The Greeks silently sprang into action, climbing out of the compartment inside the horse and descending into the Trojan square. Some headed to open the gates, others to start fires at strategic points. Their goal was to paralyze the Trojan defense through carefully planned chaos. By the time the Trojans realized what was happening, it was too late. The gates were open and the Greek army was pouring into the city. Troy fell after 10 years of resistance. However, this was not a military superiority, but the triumph of deception over trust, of wit over honor. The Greeks won because they excelled in patience and planning. This story reminds us of gifts that conceal danger. The fact that the phrase Trojan horse is still used today teaches us that the greatest threats often come in attractive disguises.
How often do we ignore warnings because we prefer to believe the good news in our daily lives? How often do we invite something smilingly into our door, only to realize it is trouble? You remember Odysseus, the man who helped end a decade-long war by inventing the wooden horse, but who was expected to return home in a few weeks and instead spent 10 years wandering the Mediterranean. Here is one of the most interesting parts of his long and strange journey home, the moment he and his men set foot on an island encircled by the magic and memories of a beautiful sorceress named Circe. Picture the moment their black ships reach yet another shore. The crew is tired, hungry, and starting to despair. They had been sailing for months, and every island they visited only brought new problems. Sea monsters, cannibal giants, and bags of wind that scattered their course, taking them farther from home. It's not hard to understand their desperation. However, this new island looks calm and peaceful at first glance. Green hills slope down towards a natural harbor. The water is of pure clarity, those enchanting blue-green tones that you would long to dive into. There are olive groves and vineyards, fig and pomegranate trees full of fruit with birds chirping on their branches. After the recent misfortunes they had endured, this place seems like paradise. Yet Odysseus has learned to be cautious about places that look too good to be true. So instead of immediately moving his crew deep into the island, he climbs to the top of a high rock and observes the island through the shimmering heat waves. What he sees stops him. Thick smoke rising from the center of the island catches his attention. This means much more smoke than just a normal cooking fire. Furthermore, a strange atmosphere, a different quality of light, and the stillness in the air catch his attention, all of which make him sense traces of magic here. That's why he decides to send a scouting party instead of going himself.
This is a decision that involves sacrificing followers while protecting the leader. Odysseus had been forced to do this many times throughout his journey. He divides his men into two groups and shakes pebbles inside a bronze helmet to determine which group will go on the reconnaissance mission. The scouting duty falls to Eurylochus, Odysseus's brother-in-law and most trusted lieutenant. Taking 22 men with him, he sets off along a stone-paved path that winds through the hills, heading toward the interior of the island. After everything they have been through, they are all tense. They live in a state of constant unease, but they are also curious, because the road they are walking on is too smooth for an uninhabited island, and it is clearly well maintained. It is obvious that someone lives on this island. Someone must be tending the roads and the plants, clearing the thickets. The journey takes up most of the morning. The path frequently loses sight of the sea behind them,
continuing with a constant upward incline. The men pass through a valley full of dazzlingly ordered flowers, far from natural appearance. The streams they encounter are clearer than any water they've seen at home and flow chillingly cold. Everything is extraordinarily beautiful, yet its beauty is somehow unsettling. When they eventually notice the smell of smoke, they come face to face with a house a few minutes later. However, this doesn't look like the witch houses of fairy tales. There are no gingerbread walls or candy windows. What they find is an entirely ordinary house, although it's hard to call it entirely ordinary. Built of polished white stone, the structure is surrounded by a seemingly flawless garden. Smoke rises from a bronze chimney, carrying the tempting sense of roasted meat and freshly baked bread. But the real strangeness begins now. The clearing around the house is full of wild animals: wolves, lions, giant bears, and wild boars, all living together in peace. The bears play like puppies, the wild boars roll in the dirt, and the wolves lie calmly in the shade. Normally, they should be tearing each other apart, or at least showing fear or aggression due to their natural instincts. However, these animals are composed and so tame that the situation itself is deeply unsettling.
As the men approach the house, they notice that the animals are scrutinizing them with eyes that resemble human intelligence. Some wolves even wag their tails and cozy up to the men like dogs greeting their owners after a long journey. This sight is not so much threatening as profoundly disturbing. It makes them feel that something is seriously wrong. A song coming from inside the house makes the atmosphere even more magical. The woman's voice is so beautiful that it seems to dominate the air, filled with haunting melodies. The words are incomprehensible, but they speak to your deepest instincts, somehow evoking feelings of safety, love, and belonging. The men find themselves stepping toward the front door without fully realizing what they are doing. Euryalus, the leader of the team, is affected by the song as much as the others, but his inherent skepticism forces him to be cautious. Having learned not to be fooled by appearances due to the oddities he has encountered before, he chooses to remain among the trees in the forest. From there, he can easily observe what is happening and maintain a safe distance if things go wrong. Before the men have a chance to knock, a woman steps out who is so beautiful that all thoughts vanish for a moment. This woman, who commands attention with her grace, is tall, with dark hair that shines like cast bronze, and eyes the color of deep seas. The simple yet perfectly fitted garment she wears moves around her like mist, reflecting an almost divine texture. This woman is Circe. This figure, whose name the men do not yet know, is the daughter of the sun god Helios. But she is a goddess exiled to this island for practicing magic that disturbs even the other gods. She has lived here alone for centuries, accompanied only by her animals. Her mastery in greeting visitors seems flawless, and the moment the men notice her, they are drawn into her spell. She greets the men with perfect politeness, as if she has known them for a long time. Yes, of course, they are here to rest and regain their strength. They are offered all the food and wine they desire. Why don't they step inside the cool and comfortable atmosphere? It seems she seeks companionship in her loneliness and has interesting stories to tell. The men, as if enchanted, follow her toward the house. The inside is even more impressive than the outside. Soft carpets cover the marble floors, and the tapestries on the walls depicting garden and sea views are truly mesmerizing. The furniture is skillfully carved and polished to a dazzling shine. The air is filled with the scent of roses and lavender, with an underlying, refreshing hint of exotic spices.
Circe invites them to a long table, and food and wine are brought out. It is not an ordinary meal, but a veritable royal feast. Roasted meats are seasoned with herbs they have never tasted. The freshly baked bread is warm and inviting.
and the fruits burst with sweet freshness. The wine seems to sparkle on their palates like liquid sunlight. The men, sailors who have lived on ship provisions for months, devour the feast with great appetite. But Eurylochus, watching the scene from the trees, feels his unease growing. Something about the atmosphere bothers him, but he struggles to pinpoint exactly what it is. Perhaps it's the almost superhuman grace in Circe's every move that disturbs him. Perhaps it's the animals around the house, following everything with eyes that are far too intelligent. Or perhaps it's simply that he has learned not to trust good fortune after all the calamities. The transformation happens so slowly that at first he isn't quite sure what he is seeing. As the men chat and laugh, they reach for more food and wine. Suddenly, one of them starts making strange noises instead of words. Another chooses to eat with his face instead of his hands, dipping his nose directly into his plate. A third man drops to his hands and knees and begins rooting around under the table for crumbs. It takes Eurylochus a few long, terrifying minutes to fully grasp what is happening. He realizes that Circe has added a drug to the wine and is using her magic. His comrades are turning into swine. The situation is not metaphorical. It is literally happening. Where there were 21 men at the table, there are now 21 grunting hogs fighting over the remnants of their last human meal. Circe approaches the new swine with a long wand in her hand. She touches each one, murmuring words in an unknown tongue, older than Greek. They look at her with eyes full of astonishment and terror. They still possess human consciousness, but can no longer speak, stand upright, or even use their hands. They are trapped with human minds, utterly confined within the bodies of pigs. Circe then performs an act that makes the scene even more disturbing. She opens a gate leading to a large sty located behind the house, and, acting like an ordinary farm worker, herds the pigmen inside. She gives them acorns, roots, and kitchen scraps as pig feed. Being hungry, they immediately begin to devour this food.
He is offered the same food and wine, laced with the same magical drugs. But when she raises her wand and speaks the words necessary to transform him into a pig, nothing happens. Faced with this, Circe is stunned for the first time in centuries. She tries the spell again, her voice louder, putting more power into her words. Still, there is no result. Odysseus stands before her completely human, unharmed and with a slight smile on the corner of his lips. He then draws his sword. This action is less a threat and more a demonstration that he understands the situation and is prepared for anything he might encounter. Then, something unexpected happens. Circe does not attempt to fight, flee, or try a new spell. Instead, she stops and looks at Odysseus for the first time, not as a victim or a plaything, but as an equal. "You must be Odysseus," she says finally. There is genuine respect in her voice this time. Circe continues, "Hermes told me that you might come here one day. He said you were the only mortal wise enough to resist my magic and brave enough to confront me. From this point on, it is no longer a battle, but a negotiation. Odysseus demands that his men be freed from their swine state and restored to human form, unharmed. Circe agrees to this request, but asks for something in return. Not treasure or service, what she seeks is companionship. She has been alone on her island for so long that she has forgotten how much she longs for conversation with someone who matches her intelligence and wisdom. Thus, a bargain is struck. Circe will bring his men back and treat them all as honored guests.
In return, Odysseus agrees to remain on the island. However, this agreement becomes complicated in unexpected ways. A few days turn into a few weeks into a season. Eventually, without anyone realizing it, a whole year passes. This period becomes the strangest year of Odysseus's life. By day, he and his men are hosted like kings in Circe's palace. They eat magnificent meals and drink wines that never cause a headache. They find a chance to rest after their harsh sea voyages and manage to recuperate. During this time, they share stories, sing songs, and enjoy the feeling of being safe again. But the nights belong only to Odysseus and Circe. They walk in gardens where the stars appear brighter than ever and talk about deep subjects, from the nature of magic and morality to the loneliness that power brings and the burden of knowledge that others do not carry.
Circe tells him secrets of the gods and the world that no one else would dare to share. Odysseus, in turn, talks about the Trojan War and the long, tiring adventure of his journey home. Over time, without even realizing it, Odysseus begins to lose his yearning for home. Ithaca becomes a distant dream, and his wife, Penelope, turns into someone he feels he met in another life. Time flows differently on Circe's island. The thought of returning home progresses toward becoming a matter so insignificant that it can be easily deferred, left for the next day or the next week. However, the one who breaks this magical trance is one of his men. After a year of luxury, they approach Odysseus with anxious faces and carefully chosen words to remind him of his true mission. Odysseus and his men do not want to seem ungrateful to Circe, who has been overly generous with their rest. But they need to remember their families waiting for them at home and why they started this journey in the first place. Saying goodbye to Circe is harder for Odysseus than any of his struggles. She doesn't try to turn him from his path. She is too proud and wise to understand the futility of forcing someone to stay. When he leaves the island, it will be impossible for him to return. The magic that protects him will be broken. But Circe gives him something no one else could offer: knowledge about the dangers of his journey home. Monsters, seductive songs, and deadly passages await them on their way. But Odysseus is smart, brave, and, if a little lucky, he can reach his homeland. As his ship pulls away from the island, he sees Circe on the shore, beautiful, lonely, and somehow fading into memory. He carries a pouch filled with moly flowers to protect against spells. But his real burden is the weight of knowing that a place you mistake for paradise can destroy your identity. As his ship sails away, you can't help but wonder which comforts distract you from your true path. Sometimes the greatest danger is not a clawed monster, but the sweet voice that tells you everything you want to hear. Odysseus learned this the hard way. They sail on the shores of the Mediterranean, where creatures with the bodies of birds sing songs that mortals cannot survive. He now understands that every island promising ease and every shortcut has made his journey more difficult and complex. Though he has left Circe's island where time stood still, her gifts remain with him: a pouch full of favorable winds, warnings about the future, and information essential for their survival.
The ship sails in calm waters. His crew is rested, their spirits cheerful. They finally believe the long nightmare is over. Odysseus, however, still remembers Circe's warnings. As they sail on seas that look no different from the ones they are currently on, the sirens are somewhere ahead. Odysseus described them carefully. These creatures sat on a small island surrounded by the white skeletons of ships whose crews had not survived the encounter, singing songs that promised perfect knowledge to anyone willing to listen. Circe explained that the sirens' real danger came from the fact that they did not behave like ordinary monsters. They did not attack ships or devour sailors. They didn't need to. Their voices were so compelling, their songs so masterfully tailored to appeal to the deepest desires of every listener, that anyone who heard them would steer their ship toward the island, regardless of the consequences. The sharp rocks around the island would then finish the job, shattering the ships of the crew, enchanted and distracted by the sirens' melodies. This is what makes the story interesting. Odysseus did not want to avoid the sirens completely. Of course, he wanted to survive the encounter, keep his ship intact and his men alive, but he was also determined to hear those unique songs. According to Circe, no human has ever heard the sirens' music and maintained his sanity for long. But the idea of experiencing something no one else had was irresistibly attractive to a man like Odysseus. So he devised a plan that was both brave and slightly mad. As they approached the sirens' territory, he ordered his men to row without getting too close to the island. He told them to melt the beeswax from their provisions and completely plug their ears so they could hear nothing but their own heartbeats. Next, he asked his crew to bind him to the mast of the ship. The knots and ropes had to be so secure that it would be impossible for him to break free even if his life was in danger. Odysseus's instructions were extremely clear. No matter what he said, how much he pleaded or threatened, or even if he promised rewards, no one was to untie him until they had sailed past the island. If he screamed in fury, they were to row faster. He also issued a warning to the crew. They must not forget that the voice calling out was not his. It was a reflection of the sirens' magic. Understanding the instructions was one thing. Following them to the letter required an entirely different kind of resolve. Although the men nodded in agreement, the hesitation in their eyes did not go unnoticed.
Odysseus was their captain, the leader they had followed through 10 years of war and wandering. But all their instincts conflicted with the idea of ignoring direct orders, even if they were influenced by magic from their captain. Yet, when the Sirens' Island approached, there was no room for doubt. The island is small and rocky, jutting out of the sea like a broken tooth. At first glance, it is empty, with no trees, grass, or life. But as they get closer, 2 figures are noticed, sitting motionless on the highest rock. The sirens possess an almost casual beauty with their flawless appearance. In addition to human heads and torsos, they have a lower body resembling large winged seabirds. Their hair dances in the ocean breeze, and their eyes mesmerize with a deep blue. Odysseus, with his men's ears plugged with wax and himself bound to the mast, sees them singing for the first time. The song begins as a faint whisper, as if it comes not from across the water, but from his own mind. As the ship approaches, the melody grows stronger, becoming complex, quickening his heart and plunging him into a sorrow he doesn't understand. Circe had told him that the sirens sing a different song to everyone. Their magic knows what the listener desires most and tailors their music accordingly. They might speak to a sailor of his waiting family, to a warrior of glory and fame, or to a merchant of treasures beyond his wildest dreams. For Odysseus, they sing songs filled with knowledge. They know his name, the strategy that ended Troy, his journey and his struggles. They call him with songs that will make him wiser than all mortals. Come, their voices call from across the water. Famous Odysseus, stop your ship and listen to our voice. No traveler has ever passed this cove with his black ship without hearing our sweet melody. Everyone who has heard it and passed on has continued his journey wiser and with greater joy. We know the suffering the Greeks and Trojans endured at Troy by the will of the gods. We are aware of everything that happens in the fruitful lands. Their gravitational pull is too strong to resist, but ultimately they offer him not gold, pleasure, or power, but pure understanding.
In that moment, grappling with questions that have preoccupied his mind for years, Odysseus feels that the answers are with them. Why had the war truly started? What were the gods thinking as this tragedy unfolded? While the hidden secrets of the world are closed to ordinary mortals, the desire to hear the siren's knowledge leaves Odysseus desperate. But he doesn't try to escape because he is afraid. No, he tries to escape because, more than anything else, he wants the ship to approach the island and to hear what the sirens will teach him. He barely notices the pain of the ropes biting into his wrists and chest. All his attention is focused on the hypnotic music that peacefully floods his ears and the promised perfect knowledge. Under its influence, he begins to shout orders at his men. Turn the rudder toward the island. Drop anchor. Wait in the shallow waters so I can hear the music better. But his voice is choked with desperation. He reads the expressions on his men's faces as they row past the island. Even with their ears plugged with wax, they could clearly see their captain struggling against his bonds. Odysseus's body language betrays his desperation and urgency. Despite this, the crew continues to follow the orders they were given. Some pull at the oars with tears in their eyes, feeling the pain of moving further away from their captain's desires with every stroke. Others act with grim determination, convinced that the Odysseus writhing bound to the mast is the same person who gave those orders. The worst for Odysseus is that the siren songs become increasingly clear and alluring. They share information about the fall of Troy that he had never heard before. This could only be told from a perspective that the gods had observed. They whisper the secrets of the future to him, warnings about the hardships awaiting him in Ithaca, the choices that lie ahead, and their inevitable consequences. But Odysseus also understands that this knowledge is a non-negotiable offer. If he doesn't proceed and stop to listen there, he will never get this opportunity again. There is no one else who can offer him this deep understanding of the world. As the ship moves away from the Siren's island, the songs gradually fade. The voices don't stop suddenly, but diminish like conversations left behind a closing door. Odysseus is seized by the feeling that the priceless answers are slipping from his grasp and realizes he will never be able to access all this information again. In a final desperate effort to free himself from the ropes, he throws his body with all his might against the mast. A terrifying cracking sound comes from the mast, but the knot does not come undone. The crew remains loyal to their decision and continues to row. Soon, the sirens' voices cease entirely. Only the howling of the wind and the sound of the waves remain. The men finally gathered their courage to approach Odysseus, clean the wax from their ears, and undo the knots. Once freed, Odysseus's first instinct is to order the ship to turn back. There is still time. They could return, approach carefully this time, and find a distance where they could hear the song without crashing on the rocks. He imagines what they would learn and what wisdom they would bring to the world. However, the men,
having watched their captain become helpless because of a song, refuse. The siren's music has overcome even the strongest will, and their only desire is to get away from that island. The ship continues its journey, taking Odysseus away from the knowledge he craved and toward Ithaca. But as the sun sets, Odysseus gazes at the receding trace of the lost island on the horizon. He tries to remember the song he heard, every word, and the hints of wisdom it promised. Perhaps this is the siren's true message. I'm not saying knowledge is dangerous, but the desire for it can become a trap. There are always unreachable secrets, other songs to be heard, and truths difficult to attain. The important thing is not to abandon curiosity. It's to recognize the moment when curiosity stops serving goals and becomes an obsession in itself. In our own lives, what songs draw us toward the rocks? What whispers tell us we can't make the right decision without more information? Constantly seeking expert opinion or research. Everything was simpler before listening to the siren's call. Before Odysseus's unfortunate journey began, there was an island that looked peaceful but concealed danger. A place intended as a simple stopover became the setting for a story that turned into a sailor's nightmare. 12 black ships sailing north from Troy, laden with treasures, tired, and full of soldiers eager to return home. The wind is favorable, the sea is calm, and Ithaca is only a few days away. But the events that followed could have been prevented with a little less curiosity and a little more caution. If Odysseus had been cautious, we wouldn't have these stories to tell. The island appears as the sun dips below the horizon, a dark silhouette against the orange sky, offering fresh water and a chance to stretch their legs on solid ground to relieve the weariness of the sea. It is larger than many islands they have passed. Its hills appear covered in pastures, and it promises beaches ideal for protecting their ships from the waves. But it has a strange aura.
Something catches Odysseus's attention, causing him to observe the island more carefully in the hours as dusk is settling. There are no lights visible, no smoke from cooking fires lit by people, and despite the island being fertile and well watered, there are no signs of settlement. In the ancient Mediterranean, it is unusual for such a favorable island to remain empty. Someone always claims it, farms, raises animals, and builds a life. They beach their ships on a smaller island nearby for the night. The men are extremely eager to explore the main island in the morning, search for food, and perhaps trade with the inhabitants. But Odysseus is more cautious than he was even during the Trojan War. He has learned well that empty spaces are often abandoned for a good reason, and islands that look beautiful are sometimes not so appealing. Still, their supplies are dwindling. The provisions they brought from Troy are running low, and the men on board are weary of the taste of hard bread, dried meat, and water drunk from salty wooden barrels. Therefore, the next morning, Odysseus decides to proceed with only one ship and take a select crew of 12 men with him. The other 11 ships will wait at a safe distance until the situation becomes clear. The landing point looks perfect. A crescent-shaped cove of white sand, sheltered by headlands on both sides. Clear water flows down from the hills. The nearby forests are full of fruit trees and wild grapes, extending almost to the edge of the beach. They can spot goats moving higher up.
Everything they are looking for seems to be here. Before the journey back to Ithaca, this island offers an extraordinary opportunity to both resupply and rest. After pulling their ship onto the sand, they begin to explore inland. As they wander, they may come across an animal track or a lightly worn path left by inhabitants of this island from older times. This walk greatly relieves them after the long days spent on the ship. The sun shines with a comforting warmth, far from scorching, filtering through the leaves that are just beginning to turn yellow with the first light of autumn. Bird song echoes through the branches, and in the distance, the loud, high-pitched bleating of goats reaches their ears. The path slowly guides them up the hills, winding through olive groves. The olive trees look well tended, but not a single human can be seen tending them. It is clear that someone has pruned these trees, cleared the thickets, and built low stone walls to prevent erosion, but the whereabouts of that person are unknown. Despite these signs of habitation, why does the island feel so desolate, even a little eerie? The truth, when it is revealed, makes them realize that the answer they find is much simpler and at the same time more disturbing than they had thought. The end of the path leads to a dark cave.
But this is not a small hermitage cave. Instead, it is a massive structure carved into the sheer rock face of the hillside. The entrance is so wide and high that 3 men could walk side by side, and it is large enough to comfortably accommodate a creature much bigger than an ordinary human. Outside the cave, they encounter tangible evidence of the island's mysterious inhabitant. A colossal pen built from giant stones, its sheer size astonishing to behold. This structure is made of rocks, each weighing what several men would struggle to lift alone. Inside the pen are the largest and healthiest sheep and goats they have ever seen. The animals' wool is smooth and thick, and their milk is incredibly dense and creamy. But the scale of everything seems somehow wrong. This stone pen could easily house 1,000 animals. The milking vessels scattered around are so huge that they are nearly wide enough for a human to bathe in. And the footprints they notice in the soil upon closer inspection. Faced with these prints, which are 3 times larger than a human foot, they finally realize what they are up against. It is at this very moment that Odysseus should have given the order for his men to immediately return to the ship. But it is precisely here that experience and common sense should have succumbed to the allure of curiosity. The cave stands there, with its inviting darkness looking attractive, as if it will reveal the island's secrets. Who lives here? How have they amassed this incredible wealth and isolation? The desire to find answers to all these questions prevails. Moreover, the cave seems empty at the moment. Whatever or whoever lives there might be tending to the animals on another part of the island, or perhaps is a way to trade with people on nearby islands. Yet they think a brief inspection might be possible. They seem to have very little time to gather clues about the nature and character of the entity that owns this place, and whether it will be friendly or hostile toward unexpected visitors. Lighting their torches, they enter the cave and realize it resembles a palace more than a simple shelter. The cave extends up the hillside, with corridors and rooms branching off the main chamber. The walls are covered with opulent tapestries,
and thick rugs are spread on the floor. But the most striking thing is the food storage. On the walls they find enormous wheels of cheese, ripened cheeses hanging on hooks, clay jars full of milk, honey, and wine, and huge baskets of bread.
These provisions are more than enough to meet their needs on the ships. Odysseus's men stare at it, assessing the situation with hope and hunger. The person who lives here might not even notice the absence of a few wheels of cheese or jars of wine. After all, they're not thieves, they're willing to trade or work. But taking some food before meeting the homeowner seems sensible. Odysseus, for some reason, is impatient to see the owner of the cave. He wonders what kind of being could live in such wealth and solitude. Furthermore, he is secretly proud. As the mastermind who ended the siege of Troy, he believes he can handle whoever lives on the island. The men wait, sharing their own provisions and eating. Their weapons are close by, but they are not threatening. As they eat, they hear heavy footsteps. These sounds come from outside the cave, and the ground shakes. The gigantic shadow that appears outside darkens the cave entrance. The silhouette is human-like, but of colossal size. When he enters the cave in a few steps, they see Polyphemus, the son of Poseidon and a representative of the Cyclops race. Calypso, the price of immortality. You know how Calypso kept Odysseus on her island, offering him immortality and trying to win him over. But let's focus less on the dramatic god legends and more on the actual emotional burden of those 7 years. Let's consider the story of a man trapped in paradise and a goddess who feels she is insufficient. When Hermes arrives with Zeus's message, the scene is quite calm. He finds Calypso tending to her immortal flowers in her garden, which require no care. Calypso understands why Hermes has come before he even speaks. Gods can sense an approaching storm. Hermes speaks directly. Let him go. He truly loved you, and you have harmed no one. Since Zeus has decreed that Odysseus's fate is to reach home, the matter is closed. Calypso does not resist this decision. When Zeus speaks, arguing is pointless. Yet she carries a deep resentment. She whispers to herself, I saved him. I pulled him from the sea when Poseidon wanted to drown him. I gave him everything: comfort, love, security, even immortality. Now the gods are punishing me by taking him away. Hermes does not reply, just gently touches her shoulder. What follows is silence and the scent of a distant land. Calypso finds Odysseus sitting on his rock, looking out at the sea. She sits beside him. They don't speak, just watch the movement of the waves. The sun warms their backs, and seabirds cry overhead. Finally, Calypso speaks. You must go. I will help you build a boat. I will give you materials. I will show you the way to follow the stars. You can leave as soon as it is ready. Odysseus slowly nods and asks, when? Calypso gives a clear answer. We can start tomorrow. It will take 4, perhaps 5 days to complete the boat. As the silence continues, Odysseus makes a surprising move, gently taking her hand and thanking her for saving me, for looking after me, and for offering more than I ever thought possible. I know I have hurt you, and I am sorry. Tears well up in Calypso's eyes, a rare sight for a goddess. She quietly asks, why is it not enough? There is astonishment and brokenness in her voice. I offered you every possibility: eternal youth, eternal life, eternal love. Yet, why do you choose a mortal woman who has likely forgotten you? Why do you prefer a mundane life that will age and lead to death?
Odysseus considers this in silence for a long time. Finally, he speaks slowly.
I'm not sure I can explain this logically. You are not insufficient, he says. That's not the issue. He gestures with his hands around the island. This place does not belong to me. I did not choose it. I did not earn it. I was merely lucky enough to be washed up on your shores. Maybe that should be enough, but it is not. Then he speaks more determinedly. I must go home. Not because it is better than here, but because it belongs to me. I chose it. The people there chose me, and even after 20 years, we continue to choose each other. Calypso pauses and replies, Perhaps Penelope has remarried. Your son might not recognize you. Your kingdom might have even forgotten you. Odysseus nods. I know, but I still have to find out. I have to try. Calypso understands in that moment. The issue is not just about Penelope. Perhaps it is a little bit about her, but the main theme is being human. A profound realization begins to emerge. To be human is to have the chance to make choices, even if they are wrong, to have the ability to prefer pain and death over comfort and immortality. The gods cannot understand this because they never choose. Everything is under their control. Everything is fixed and eternal. The next morning, they set to work and begin building the boat together. Calypso shows him where the sturdiest trees are. Tall, straight-growing trees, ideal for a ship's frame. She gives him bronze tools that cut easily, their sharpness splitting the wood as effortlessly as a piece of cheese. Calypso works alongside Odysseus. With the experience of endless years, she demonstrates flawless mastery in measuring, cutting, and joining the pieces. This effort, seemingly mundane from the outside, requires magnificent patience. The construction of the ship takes 5 days, exactly as predicted. They work from the early hours of the morning until the day warms up considerably. They take breaks to rest at noon, but return to work in the evening, almost until complete darkness falls upon them. This cooperation is deeply sincere. Though they don't talk much, the silence brings peace to both. On the third day, while weaving the sail for the ship, Calypso asks an unexpected question. Will you tell people about me? When you go home and tell your stories, will I have a place in those stories? Odysseus stops his weaving and thinks for a few seconds. Would you like to? He asks finally. I don't know, Calypso replies. Maybe I just want them to remember that I existed, that I loved someone, even if they didn't love me in the same way. Odysseus responds quietly, I love you, but not enough to give up everything. His words resonate with honesty, and Calypso appreciates it. Then tell them, Calypso says finally. Tell me about me. Speak of the goddess who offered immortality and how you turned that offer down. Perhaps this will become one of those cautionary tales that mothers tell their sons. Be wary of the graceful goddesses who bring gifts. They both smile at the situation, a small moment of humor amidst the sadness. On the 5th day, the boat is complete. This sturdily built boat, crafted with great care, is flawless with its tightly woven sail and a rudder balanced so that one person can easily control it. Calypso fills the boat with enough provisions for the journey. It is more than enough for the voyage. Bread that will not mold, wine that will not sour, dried meat and fruit, and a wineskin full of fresh water that will never run dry. In addition to this, she shares information that will ensure his survival. You must sail east and northeast, she says.
you must follow the Great Bear constellation. Since it never dips below the horizon, it will help you find your direction even at night. With a good wind, you should see the island of Shiri in 15 days, 20 days at most. The people there are called the Phaeacians, and they are highly skilled sailors. They will help you with the rest of your journey home. But what about Poseidon? Asks Odysseus. Poseidon, the sea god, has been my enemy ever since I blinded Polyphemus, he says. Will he allow me to pass? Calypso's face turns serious. I cannot protect you once you leave the island. My power ends at the shore. Poseidon will do whatever he wishes. But Zeus has decreed that you must reach home. So Poseidon can only delay you. He cannot destroy you entirely. Probably. This probably hangs in the air like an impending storm. However, there is nothing to be done about it. Odysseus has already made his decision. When morning arrives, the sea is calm and the wind is steady from the west, so they launch the boat into the water. Odysseus loads his supplies, checks his rigging one last time, and tests the rudder mechanism. Everything is ready. There is no longer any reason to postpone. On the edge of the shore, Calypso stops him by gripping his arm and says one last thing. She extends a piece of cloth from her robe. It is as light as air and shimmers like sunlight. In the worst case, if your boat sinks, wrap this around your chest. No matter how exhausted you are or how rough the waves become, it will keep you afloat. When you reach safety, throw it back into the sea. It will return to me. Odysseus carefully takes this magical cloth and realizes how immense its power is. Why are you doing this? You know I will never remember you when I leave. Because I love you, Calypso replies calmly. And love is wanting someone to be safe even if they are not with you. They pause for a brief moment, looking at each other, a goddess and a mortal. This is the final farewell of the immortal and the mortal. Then Odysseus leans forward and gently places a farewell kiss on her forehead, as if saying goodbye to a close friend.
Thank you for everything, says Odysseus. I hope you find someone who can stay with you. There will be no one else, Calypso says. In these words, there is neither drama nor tragedy, merely the statement of a stark truth, because mortals do not live long enough to come to such places twice, and gods do not show up half drowned and interesting on beaches. You were my chance for such a love, no one else. And he didn't. He steps out. It does not matter. You can focus your thoughts on other things. But as Odysseus pushes the boat into deep waters and hoists the sails, you question whether he truly wanted to do it. Now, suddenly on that wide beach, surrounded by her exquisite gardens, on her perfect island, and on the edge of endless seeming emptiness, immortality. She looks very small, very alone. When Odysseus turns and notices the island beginning to shrink on the horizon, he looks back one more time. There on the shore, he can barely make out a faint shadow waving to him with one arm slightly raised in the air. Then the wind completely fills the sails, and the boat begins to pick up speed. When he turns around again after a while, the island has already disappeared, as if it had never existed. It felt as if all of it had been a hazy dream seen while drowning. But he knew the cloth in his backpack was real. The knowledge Calypso gave him was equally real. And in the hidden corners of his heart, the memory of those 7 years, which seemed eternal yet impossibly short, lived on. He had turned away from immortality, luxury, and the love of a goddess because he needed to find out if his mortal life was waiting for him somewhere beyond the wine-dark sea, or if it was not. Now, alone on a boat built with the help of a goddess, sailing toward his homecoming, life, or whatever it may be, he does not know if he made the right decision. All he knows is this: he had to make that choice. Sometimes that is all you have, the freedom to make a choice rather than the certainty of having made the right one. So, what would you say to a charming goddess offering you an eternal paradise? Would you have the courage to say no,
or the wisdom to say yes. There are moments that fundamentally change a life. Moments when the echoes of a single decision spread across years and turn into legend. This moment happened for King Agamemnon just before the Trojan War began. Imagine a beach where thousands of ships stand motionless in the sea, waiting for a wind that refuses to blow. Once again, we rewind time and return to those moments. Let's go back to the moment before Odysseus' lonely journey, or his encounter with the Cyclops, before his time in Circe's magical world, or even before the famous wooden horse of Troy. Let's return to the epic beginning of all these stories when the Greek kings and heroes gathered their armies and set sail for Troy to bring back Helen.
Imagine now a natural harbor on the eastern coast of Greece, the Aulis shore. The coast is not filled with a few boats like the one Odysseus sailed, but with a full 1,000 ships, each carrying 50 men. The largest army the Greek world could gather had assembled at this point. They all had a common goal: to cross the Aegean Sea and reach Troy, to make up for the shame caused by King Priam's son, Paris, who had abducted Menelaus's wife, Helen. But there was a big problem. The wind was blowing from the wrong direction. It was impossible to sail against the fierce wind that had been blowing from the east for days, for weeks. It was completely impossible to move 1,000 ships against this wind using oars. The winds needed to change direction, or at least stop, for the passage to be completed. Initially, the men didn't much care. They were fed and paid well enough. They had time to maintain their equipment, sharpen their skills, and tell stories around the evening fires. Some of them had never been so far from their villages. Sitting in a camp with warriors from other kingdoms was an adventure for them. However, as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the mood began to change. Food supplies started to dwindle, and the men grew restless. Their impatience increased, and they were tired of waiting. Some began to suspect that this expedition might be cursed, and that the gods were trying to convey something by keeping them on this shore. The leader of the army was Agamemnon. He had been chosen as the most powerful king of Greece because his brother Menelaus was Helen's husband. The issue was seen as a family matter in which everyone agreed to participate. However, this leadership also brought great responsibilities. As the men began to seethe with impatience and frustration, they looked to Agamemnon for a solution and answers so they could proceed to Troy before the army completely disbanded. Therefore, Agamemnon consulted with prophets who claimed to read the will of the gods from the flight of birds, the entrails of animals, and the patterns of smoke. And the message they conveyed was both terrifying and quite clear. The goddess Artemis was angry. Artemis, who controls the winds, had no intention of releasing them until Agamemnon paid a price. Why was Artemis angry? Various stories are told about this. Some say Agamemnon had boasted that he was a better hunter than the goddess herself, an arrogant act that could get him in trouble with the immortals. Others claim he had killed a sacred deer in one of Artemis's groves, or had forgotten to offer appropriate sacrifices to the goddess before setting off on the expedition. However, the exact reason is not very important. What is important is that Artemis demanded something from him before she would allow the winds to change direction. What she demanded was Agamemnon's daughter, Iphigenia. Not permanently, the prophets were quite clear about this. Artemis did not want to take her as a nymph or a priestess. She wanted her as a sacrifice to be offered in order to release the winds.
She demanded the blood of a girl to be spilled on the altar in exchange for launching 1,000 ships and ensuring fair weather for a war that would last 10 years. Agamemnon was in shock. Of course, he felt this way. He was a king and a warrior, accustomed to battles that required difficult decisions. But this situation was an entirely different matter. The person demanded as a sacrifice was Agamemnon's own child, his eldest daughter, the delicate girl who ran to greet him when he returned from the hunt, who sat on his knee and learned to read while he reviewed reports sent by governors. Agamemnon initially refused this request,
Absolutely not. He would wait for the wind to change naturally. He would try to find another way to appease Artemis. If necessary, he would cancel the entire expedition, but he would not sacrifice his own daughter for a war that had not even begun. But the pressure was mounting. Other kings came to him, individually or in small groups, expressing their impatience. "We have been waiting for months," they said. "Our men want to go home. Our supplies are running out. If we don't set off soon, the army will disband and weaken, and we will never be able to gather such a large force again. Troy will have won without a single battle." Some expressed these issues more openly. Agamemnon's brother, Menelaus, emphasized that family ties required mutual loyalty. If Agamemnon refused to save Menelaus' wife at the cost of his own daughter, what did that say about their brotherhood? Odysseus, who never allowed sentimentality to override rational decisions, pointed out that they weren't actually talking about killing a girl. According to Odysseus' explanation, the real issue was preventing a failure that would result if the expedition could not continue and preventing potential deaths. Otherwise, even though thousands of people would seem to have been saved from death in the army, the leaders who returned home empty-handed after months of arduous preparations would be met with anger by their own people and perhaps killed. Meanwhile, the prophet Calypso added a different dimension to the issue. He said the gods had spoken and the consequences would be harsher than they could imagine if they did not fulfill this request. Perhaps the winds would continue to blow from the east forever. Perhaps storms would destroy all the ships. Perhaps Artemis's wrath would even manifest as a plague that would bring death to the camp. Agamemnon spent sleepless nights in his tent, searching for ways out of this dilemma. One thought that crossed his mind was to load his own ships and return, leaving the others to their fate. But he knew that such a move would brand him as a coward after everything that had happened. He even considered lying to the prophets and convincing people that the offering to Artemis in the sacrifice ceremony was actually an animal. However, he was sure that trying to deceive the gods would not make things better, but much, much worse. Finally, he thought of seeking help from his wife, Clytemnestra. But his wife was not with them. Clytemnestra was managing the kingdom and Mycenae in their absence. This gave him another idea that was horrifying but might work. He immediately wrote a message to Clytemnestra. The message was carefully crafted. It had a cheerful tone and did not raise the slightest suspicion. In his letter, he explained that the army was almost ready to set off. He said that good news to celebrate before departure would be morale-boosting for everyone. He mentioned that Adrastus' son, Tricus, was still an infant, but Achilles was among them, the greatest warrior of Greece, young, handsome, and full of glory. He added that if Iphigenia married him, a better husband for their daughter would be impossible. The words in the letter said, "Bring her to Aulis. We will hold the wedding here, witnessed by our army, and then we will set sail for Troy with this great enthusiasm." But the planned event was neither a real wedding nor any kind of celebration. This was a complete fabrication.
Achilles had no idea about the message, but neither did Clytemnestra nor Iphigenia. When the message arrived, both were excited. Iphigenia, at a young age, perhaps 14 or 15, was of marriageable age, and Achilles' fame was so great that being chosen by someone like him seemed like a major prize. Thus, accompanied by a small retinue of servants and guards, mother and daughter set off for Aulis, traveling from the Greek countryside to the coast. Throughout the journey, Iphigenia talked about what she would wear on her wedding day, and whether Achilles was as handsome as the stories described. However, Clytemnestra, who had once married a heroic husband and learned that heroes are often distant husbands, was less excited. Still, she was pleased with the thought that it was a good match on a political level. Because she knew Agamemnon did not think much about such matters, she was glad that he was concerned with his daughter's future. Yet, upon reaching the camp, they encountered an unexpected welcome. The men seemed quite cheerful for a bride-to-be, but amidst all the enthusiasm, an unusual atmosphere was discernible. There was a strange quality Clytemnestra struggled to define. The men's gazes were far from celebratory. There was a tension that made it feel as if this was not her daughter's happiest day. Agamemnon greeted them with open arms and a smile, but his wife, Clytemnestra, had known him for a long time and immediately noticed the tension in his eyes. It was clear something was wrong. When she asked about the wedding preparations, he stalled, giving vague answers, merely saying that everything was arranged. When he tried to shut down the topic, stating she didn't need to worry about the details, her suspicions deepened. The situation became even clearer when she coincidentally encountered Achilles. Achilles greeted her warmly, and he was even thanked, but Achilles looked confused. "What daughter? What marriage?" he asked, as if listening to a foreign language. It was clear he knew nothing about it. The confrontation with Agamemnon was silent but intense. Clytemnestra was not one to express her anger by screaming or crying. Hers was a fierce rage that came with icy composure, sharp and dangerous. "What have you done?" she asked her husband. "Why is our daughter here?" Agamemnon was cornered. With no escape route left and time running out, he had to confess everything. The stalled winds, the prophecies, Artemis's demand, and the pressure from the other kings. It was a terribly heavy choice. His daughter's life or the duty tied to his leadership of the army. He had been forced to make an impossible choice between carrying thousands of men to war for the honor of Greece. Clytemnestra's response required no waiting. It was clear and final. No! She told him to take Iphigenia and return home. The gods could take their winds, their wars, and their demands and drown. Other means to reach Troy would be found, or they would not. But their daughter belonged at home, safe. But it was too late. The other kings had learned that Iphigenia was in the camp, and they would not allow Agamemnon to send his family back. The area around the royal tent was surrounded by guards. They were not visibly threatening, but their presence conveyed a sufficiently clear message. Clytemnestra wanted to take Iphigenia, but her path was gently blocked. The sacrifice would take place at dawn, the altar was ready, and the priest was waiting. The army had gathered to bear witness, and Agamemnon was there, bearing the responsibility for his decision. Clytemnestra, despite the pain, was determined not to leave her daughter alone.
Iphigenia was brought, accompanied by priestesses. The priestesses treated her kindly, but did not fully answer her questions about Achilles' wedding. According to some accounts, Artemis caused a deer to appear on the altar before the knife descended and carried Iphigenia away to a distant place. However, the oldest versions say Agamemnon sacrificed his daughter. His daughter pleaded with her father not to let her die, but there was no salvation. The father, with a face like stone, watched silently as the blood mixed with the sand. The wind changed, and the awaited western breeze began. The army prepared with joy, and the ships set sail. But Agamemnon remained on the shore for a long time, watching Clytemnestra and the shrouded body. Clytemnestra was silent. She did not cry. She loaded her daughter's body onto a chariot and drove away with a deep warning in her gaze. Agamemnon watched the chariot disappear and returned to Mycenae. The war would last 10 years. He would win victories, glory, and treasure. But when he returned home, Clytemnestra would be waiting for him. She had thought about her daughter's sacrifice for all those years and planned her revenge. This is the beginning of another story. For now, we only have a question without a clear answer. Was Agamemnon right? If the death of one person meant saving thousands, if sacrificing his daughter meant fulfilling his duty to his people, does that make him right? Or are there things you should never do, no matter how heavy the cost? In your own life, what decision would you make when caught between the people you love and the duties you are responsible for, facing impossible choices? Whichever path you choose,
How do you continue to live with that decision afterward? The contest of the bow. After waiting 20 years, Odysseus finally arrives home in the guise of an old beggar. This is his final stop after all the adventures, setbacks, and lost years. A contest. Not a battle. Not a grand and dramatic confrontation either. Just an archery contest to determine who will marry Penelope and become the next king of Ithaca. Do you remember Penelope, the strong woman who refused to believe her husband was dead for 20 years? For 3 years, she tried to buy time with a shroud she wove every evening, promising to finish it, only to unravel it in the morning. But now the tricks and delaying tactics have run out. Hundreds of suitors who have invaded her home surround her, waiting. She can delay no longer. The suitors demand a decision, and one final test comes to Penelope's mind. Perhaps it is a way to buy a little more time, or perhaps a way to truly find out if Odysseus has returned, or if the beggar who arrived recently is merely a random stranger. Penelope goes to the storeroom where Odysseus's belongings are kept. Clothes, armor, weapons, everything is covered in dust. No one has touched them for 20 years. And Penelope takes the bow, a special bow. This bow is no ordinary weapon. It is a composite bow made of layers of horn, sinew, and wood. It stores extraordinary power and unleashes great potential when strung. Odysseus acquired this bow in his youth from a dying comrade in arms, and he is the only person in all of Greece who can string and use it. Merely possessing the bow requires rare physical strength, while drawing it correctly and using it accurately demands tremendous skill.
Penelope takes this bow and carries it to the great hall, where the suitors are now impatiently waiting. The suitors, lounging lazily after the feast, raise their heads. She successfully captures their attention with this unexpected move. Penelope's every movement is attention-grabbing, because to the suitors, she holds the key to marriage and Odysseus' throne. In a calm voice, but with a pounding heart, she explains her plan to the suitors. I have decided to choose my new husband. The contest will be with Odysseus' bow. You will line up the axes, and the person who shoots an arrow through the rings of 12 axes will be my choice. The suitors are excited. Finally, there is a contest that promises a clear resolution. They examine the bow and assess its weight. The strong ones try to string the bow but fail. The bow is resistant. It won't bend enough to fit the string. The suitors agree to try again the next day when they are more rested. That night, Odysseus, still disguised as an old beggar, listens to the suitors boasting. All are confident, believing it will be easy to string the bow. When morning comes and the contest begins, the conditions are set. 12 bronze axes lined up at the same height, forming a challenging target for the archers. Merely stringing the bow requires strength. It is the suitors' turn. The strong ones step forward, but none can string the bow. They try all techniques, sitting down, using support, oiling the bow, but they achieve no success. As the hours pass, the contest becomes a disgrace. These men who proclaim themselves strong and skilled are left helpless over the bow. The arrogant Antinous suggests postponing the contest to try again later. The archery contest was postponed, using the feast held in honor of Apollo that day as an excuse. It was said it would be attempted again after the offerings tomorrow, but the real reason was the need for more practice. The other suitors welcomed this delay. Just then, the old beggar, Odysseus, rose from where he was quietly sitting and spoke. He was worn and unrecognizable. "My lords," he said in a humble voice. "I would just like to try the bow to see if I remember my old skills. Not for the contest, of course." Some laughed at this request, but others were disturbed. How could a beggar dare? Even his proximity to Penelope was criticized, and now his interest in archery provoked even more reaction. Meanwhile, Telemachus stepped forward and allowed him to try the bow. "Perhaps he will give us all a good laugh," he tried to ease the tension. Penelope wanted to object, but Telemachus gently sent her to her room. Penelope left uneasily. "Would you like me to continue the story of Odysseus and the contest of the bow, or should we return to the fate of Agamemnon?" The bow was handed to Odysseus. As his fingers traced the surface of the bow, it was as if he were touching an old friend from the past. Ignoring the mockery of the suitors, he easily strung the bow, set the string in place, and prepared it. Everything took just a few seconds. Then he nocked an arrow and with a single movement launched it toward the target.
The arrow passed through the center of the heads of the 12 axes lined up in a row and embedded itself in the farthest wall of the hall. A deep silence fell. No one spoke or breathed. At that moment, Odysseus straightened, and the burden of years seemed to lift from him. The old beggar was gone, and only the power and honor of his former self remained. Odysseus stood there. In his place stood a warrior, a king, a man who had invented the wooden horse, blinded a Cyclops, and heard the siren's song. He aimed once more with the arrow in his hand, but this time his target was not the axes. He aimed at Antinous, the worst of the suitors, who was lifting a goblet to his lips. The arrow pierced his throat. Antinous fell to the floor, his goblet clattered, and wine and blood mixed, spreading across the floor. Someone whispered, "Odysseus," and the name spread through the hall like fire. After that, everything happened quickly and mercilessly. Telemachus appeared with a few loyal servants and armed with arrows. The suitors panicked and tried to find weapons, but their drunkenness and the fact that the weapons were stored in another room made things even more difficult for them. Odysseus stood at the door with his bow, striking down anyone who tried to reach the armory. This was not a fair fight, but it didn't need to be fair, because these men had been stealing from him for years, disrespecting his wife, plotting to kill his son, occupying his table, and drinking his wine. Odysseus showed them no mercy because they had shown neither love nor respect to him or his family. When it was all over, all the suitors were dead. The great hall was now nothing more than a slaughterhouse. Odysseus, his disguise completely gone, stood there openly revealed. In the very center of everything, the bow still in his hand, he breathed deeply, standing in his true identity. Servants began to clean the hall. The bodies were carried away. The news spread like wildfire through the palace and the island. Odysseus has returned. The king is home. But a test still awaited Odysseus, a final moment of truth. Penelope, who had heard the sounds of fighting and cries from her room upstairs but did not know exactly what was happening, descended into the hall. She saw Odysseus there, clean, but with eyes that looked deeply, as if he had just emerged from a new battle. Everyone expected Penelope to run to him, to hug him, to celebrate his return. But Penelope merely stood at the other end of the room, looking at him carefully. 20 years is a very long time. People change. Penelope questioned whether this man was truly her husband, someone who looked like him, a trick played by the gods, or a perfect impostor. Then she said loudly to the servant, "Prepare the parental bedroom." She commanded, "Move the bed down here to the hall so our guest can sleep comfortably." Odysseus's reaction was immediate and highly significant. "You cannot move that bed," he said. "I made that bed, and one of its posts is still a living olive tree.
You would have to cut down the tree or tear down half the palace to move the bed. Unless, of course, someone did that in my absence.
These words pointed to details that only the true Odysseus could have known, because he had made that bed himself in the first year of their marriage, and he had built the entire bedroom around an olive tree that he had not cut down because it was sacred. Only Penelope and Odysseus knew this secret of their room. Finally, Penelope ran to him. She now believed. Argos, the silent sentinel. Penelope, who waited patiently for 20 years, finally had her husband home. There were untold years and unshared stories between them. They talked through the night as her husband recounted his experiences at sea and his past struggles. Slowly, they began to move past a long separation and become a couple again. The bow that initiated this reunion was put back in its chest, still strung. This story reminds us that some things exist with a power that does not fade with distance or time. They only need to be recognized and attempted by the right person. Well, do you have the patience in your own life to pass this test? Can someone else solve a test that belongs only to you? As we approach the end of the Greek stories, let the focus not be on the gods or epic wars, but on a dog, a symbol of loyalty, waiting for its master. Before Odysseus left for Troy, he had trained his puppy, Argos, making him a skillful hunting dog and a loyal friend. Argos, though he did not understand Odysseus's absence, never stopped waiting for him. Initially, Argos was looked after by his son, Telemachus, for a few years. However, as Telemachus grew older, he had other responsibilities, and his interest in the dog waned. As the palace filled with chaos, the servants could no longer care for him either. Over the years, Argos lost his former splendor, turning into an old, forgotten dog lying on dung heaps. But all this time, he never stopped waiting for his master. He was in a place out of sight, where no one would pay attention to him or cross his path. His shiny fur was matted, his body bony and weak. He was covered in fleas, barely scratching with his powerless paws. His once lively eyes were clouded with age. At 19-20 years old, he was quite old for a dog. In ancient Greece, dogs usually did not live longer than 10-12 years. Argos's long life might seem surprising to some and tragic to others. He lived forgotten and ignored. No one cared enough to kill him or chase him away. But the most touching part was that he was still waiting. For 20 years, he hoped for Odysseus's return home. Dogs do not give up on humans the way humans give up on each other. Their loyalty does not shift, their hope does not run out. Argos did not think that his master had probably died or that he should transfer his loyalty to someone else. He waited every day, every year. He aged, he weakened, but he never reached the end of his hope. He never gave up on the possibility that Odysseus would return one day. 20 years later, Odysseus returns in the guise of an old beggar. As he heads toward the palace, he passes by Argos. The courtyard is full of noisy suitors, and no one pays attention to him. Only Argos notices. The dog is lying on his heap of dung, consumed by old age and neglect. But as Odysseus passes by, Argos feels something. His ears perk up, his tail twitches. Despite all the years and changes, he knows that this is his master.
He tries to stand up, as he did 20 years ago, but his legs no longer function. He lifts his head for a moment and wags his tail slightly. Even though his old eyes are clouded, he focuses on Odysseus with joy. His master recognizes him, despite his dirty and weakened state. However, Odysseus has to leave quickly so as not to betray his emotions. He had to move forward without revealing his identity. He wanted to stop, pet Argos, and comfort him by telling him what a good dog he was. But he couldn't. His disguise was essential for his revenge. If he revealed his character now, or showed that he recognized this dog, his plan would be ruined. So he passed by without saying a word. After 20 years, he had to pass by his dog, whom he had finally reunited with, prioritizing revenge and strategy. As he walked past the old dog, someone turned to his disguised self and said, "He used to be a very good hunting dog. He belonged to Odysseus." It was said that Argos was the best hunting dog on the island. He could find anything. But he had been lying there for years. No one had cared for him since his master left. The suitors had cared about nothing of Odysseus, and the servants had not been able to look after him. Odysseus listened silently, lacking the courage. Without a word, he headed toward the palace, where the bow contest would take place. But his mind was on Argos. He was preoccupied with the dog who had recognized him, but only saw him pass by after waiting for 20 years. In the courtyard, Argos lay down. His tail slowly stopped. Argos's longing had ended. He had recognized his master, perhaps feeling a little less forgotten. As Odysseus prepared for the bow contest, Argos said goodbye. He died silently. After waiting 20 years, he closed his eyes with the satisfaction of seeing his master. There was no dramatic end, only the peace that followed a long life spent in loyalty. Odysseus learned of this later, after he had defeated the suitors and finally revealed his identity. He buried Argos like honoring a valiant warrior. He recounted his youth, his hunts, and his time as the best hunting dog in Ithaca. But all this did not mask the tragedy. Argos waited 20 years to see his master's return, and at the moment he did, he received not even a single loving greeting due to human concerns. This loyal friend, who had dedicated his life to Odysseus, died alone on a dung heap. His last consolation, a fleeting moment of recognition from afar. It is a small but deeply profound moment in Odysseus's epic homecoming. In most narratives, this scene is only mentioned in a short paragraph before moving on to more exciting events: the bow contest, the defeat of the suitors, the reunion with Penelope. But perhaps this is the most genuine and heartfelt moment in the entire story. The moment that best captures the harsh reality of life when you're away from home for a long time. Because time changes everything.
People either leave or are cut off from life. No matter how justified your reasons are, the world does not wait for you. And sometimes, even the bonds you thought were the strongest will crack and break under the weight of your absence. Except for one thing: dogs. They just wait. They wait, without the need for logic, hope, or a realistic expectation that waiting will be rewarded, because it is in their nature. And perhaps this says a lot about the essence of a love that is unconditional, uncalculated, and freely given. So, who is waiting for you in your life's adventures, along the paths you take? And more importantly, will you truly be able to recognize them when you return? Will you stop and take the time to notice their waiting? Or will you be so engrossed in your grand plans and irreversible deeds that you will fail to see the small loyalty that waited patiently for you in your absence? Pause for a moment now and think about this. Remember Argos,
who weakly wagged his tail one last time from the dung heap. Think of Penelope, who patiently wove and then unraveled at the loom. Consider the silent patience that made all these heroic stories possible. Perhaps when you wake up, you will remember to appreciate those who wait for you, those who remain loyal to you, and the people and dogs who hold on to hope even when all hope is lost. Because ultimately, perhaps such a quiet and unrequited loyalty is much more touching than any wooden horse, glorious battle, or vanquished monster. Good night, friends. May your dreams be as serene as Argos's final resting place. And when you return home, may there always be someone there who has been waiting for you.